Welcome to the closing session, for which I'd like to acknowledge once more the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today and their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge our generous sponsors one more time that have made this event possible. So we have the Royal Flying Doctors Service, Hester Superannuation, Charles Sturt University, the Australian Government Department of Health, Flinders University, the Queensland Government Department of Health, Starlight Children's Foundation, Flinders NT, North and West Remote Health, the Tasmanian Government Department of Health, Caring at Home, Monash University, Are You OK?, the Lowitja Institute and the University of Sydney School of Rural Health. Now, a couple of orders of business first. We've got some winners to announce. So firstly, we've got winners of the photo competition. First place has gone to Melanie Pensini from Queensland with her photo titled New Experiences Read Better Together. And they should be on the screen now. And that's taken the wind out of my sails a bit for the runner-up, which is from Emily Storman of Broken Hill in New South Wales. So well done to both of you. Okay, so we also have the incentive competition that was drawn at lunch. However, it appears that the winner wasn't at lunch. So I've got a list to progressively work through of winners. And if none of them are here, I'm going to keep this myself. So it's a Fitbit. So the winner of the Fitbit, and you need to stand up and make your way to the stage reasonably quickly. The winner of the Fitbit is Sonia Catley from GP Synergy. Can you stand up and wave? Sonia? No, I'm going to... Yep, no. All right. Sorry, Sonia. Next, do we have Ellen Drain from Anglicare CQ? Ellen? Yep. Yay! I'd now like to welcome Jenny May to the stage. She's the chair of our recommendations committee to present the final priority recommendations. Thanks, Jenny.
Well, thank you. Aren't we better together? And the priority recommendations that I'm going to present to you are a compilation of the voice, if you like, from the conference, 1,100 attendees, 213 recommendations, and many of them from the heart. I guess the thing that stands out is the fact that throughout Australia there are so many good projects, good thinking and innovation that has been demonstrated for those of us who've had the opportunity to listen to some of our speakers, and also so ably demonstrated has been that the problem is not solved. And I've got the three quotes that I used for those of you who are here this morning, which I think epitomise some of the themes or the concerns that have come from the 15th NRHC delegates. And as I said, these recommendations belong to the conference. And Beau's eloquent presentation talking about surgical solutions to solve social problems and exhorting us to think about the consequences of poverty as the major contributor to the health inequality that she sees. Harry Burns, who so ably asked us to do something and act, and said to us that as frontline workers, that we were so part of the solution and that cooperating with our communities was the way forward. And I've added one of our participants' recommendations, which really spoke to me, and that was one of the strengths of rural communities, and that is our inclusivity and our acceptance of diversity. So can I commend the resilience and the capacity that we have in rural communities. So as I present what feels in my heart a little bit like a whole lot of deficit recommendations, I do it from the point of view of the strength and the foundation that has been provided. So there are many good programs, there is much work in the workforce space, but again, we have lots of recommendations and good thinking about how we can do so much better and how we need to do so much better. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander health. The gap in health outcomes remains completely unacceptable and should be the major pressing issue for all Australians. And we confirm our commitment as delegates to urgent and comprehensive action about closing the gap. But we do that on the basis that we understand that that has to be done in partnership and with leadership from Aboriginal leaders and their communities. And as such, we endorse the Uluru Statement, and we ask that all governments respond from the heart and commit to engaging in a process of truth-telling and agreement-making that actually works to eradicate one of the major problems, which is discrimination and racism, with the object of improving health and wellbeing. We endorse and commit that the funding should be used to expand existing Aboriginal community-controlled comprehensive healthcare services. And as you will see with some of the ongoing recommendations, that here is an exemplar and a way of working that should be absolutely considered in non-Aboriginal communities and considered as part of a workforce solution and a workforce model in areas of otherwise what we might call market failure. The other thing that we are very keen to do from the top, and this was echoed in the recommendations process, was recognise and support the essential role of Aboriginal health practitioners and workers. Now, it's wider than just Aboriginal health workers, because Aboriginal practitioners who work in many of our AMSs have a huge responsibility, and I thought the walking in two worlds analogy was really helpful to try and identify and highlight the added complexity and challenge of our Aboriginal health practitioners. So we need to do and we need to commit, not only as governments, but as organisations and individuals, to ways of creating workable, reasonable workforce models for Aboriginal practitioners to work. There was a very strong theme, and Minister, you would have been inspired by some of the speakers that we've had over the last 3 days, absolutely nailing for us the centrality of the determinants of health in health and wellbeing. And we added an extra recommendation there which came from this morning, and some people were very quick on their fingers to get it in before 10 o'clock. But the whole of government approach to rural poverty, which we heard really echoed this morning, and this includes approaches to taxation and welfare reform, and increasing the New Start allowance and stable housing would be a great first step. We're interested in a national rural wellbeing strategy, as you can see, as a way of silo busting. We're interested in changing and challenging the way that we measure wellness and illness, because what we measure is what we fund, and what we know is that there's this yawning gap between what we see we need and what gets funded. There was a little bit out there recommendation about a new ministerial department of the first 2,000 days, and this is an attempt which has been tried in other places very successfully to cross sectors. And it's the whole concept that we can look at a strategy that takes account of life events rather than the siloed approach that we currently take. And there is a mention there of the absolute challenge about managing and supporting those that have, we see who are impacted by intergenerational trauma, and the fact that obviously our outcomes in mental health, wellness and wellbeing are being adversely impacted in an ongoing fashion by our lack of acknowledgement and identification of this group of people who need a life stage approach to support. There was a huge number of recommendations, as I mentioned this morning, about climate change, but very sensibly about how we embed strategies around climate change into our existing models of care and funding. And obviously they need to change, and the National Sustainable Development Unit is one way in which we could actually own the Australian response, which we are expected to be giving and which we've signed up for the Sustainable Development Goals. So how are we going to get there? What's the pathway? What's the roadmap? So the National Sustainable Development Unit is one thought by a participant about how we might actually action that. And that would have the remit of thinking about climate change and planetary health, among other things, and how we're going to meet the population shifts that we've heard about, the issues around renewable energy, around agricultural industry adjustment, and about biodiversity loss, all that are going to have a disproportionate effect on rural communities. I've glossed over the National Climate, Health and Wellbeing Strategy, and I've also glossed over a rural proofing lens, which is again a method which we could consider, and that is to look at local level solutions to climate adaptation. And as I said, these recommendations need to be seen as dealing with individuals, with organisations and localities and communities, as well as with government. The perennial access, access to health services as a major component of the inequality or gap in health outcomes and wellbeing. So again, absolutely seeing that pooled funding mechanisms that use MBS funding streams, state government resources and PHN Commission funds to create comprehensive primary care services, and we have such an exemplar with the Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations. To think about how we can organise funding so funding agreements are not the barrier, particularly to workforce solutions, because what we find all the time is that people can't put together and collaborate with fractional positions towards, say, getting an allied health professional or a diabetes educator in a spot, because 0.2 of the funding is only committed for 12 months under a PHN program, or only 0.4 of the funding is available under a state health program, or the Commonwealth is under a short-term project. So we must find a way, and there are ways where you can have funding agreements that are established and that are reviewed annually to make sure that they're meeting their KPIs, but they're on a minimum term so that we can get in and employ people. The difference is, as we well know, that if you want to work in a rural community, you have to live in a rural community. So you can't get up and move when the contract finishes. You need some stability of your employment. We need to be thinking about ways of building those things into our models. Now, I'm aware that I'm on a time limit, so I am not going to gloss over the unacceptable number of Indigenous deaths caused by suicide or the need for an urgent response working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. We do not have all the solutions. I'm not pretending we do, but it must be an urgent commitment on behalf of us all to consider the ingredients of poverty and health and wellbeing that we've heard of in this conference and move towards a system that is not characterised by this unacceptable level of Indigenous and particularly youth suicide. I will gloss over the workforce recommendations. They are many, and they look at all parts of the workforce. We commend the current foundational work that has been done in developing rural generalist streams, and we ask that that might be used as a model to think about allied health generalist positions. We want to better use the workforce we've got. We want to support all parts of the workforce, and for instance, remote health managers. We've discovered and we know that they are pivotal to recruitment and retention in our remote health services. Unless we address the workforce issues around the whole workforce, we are not going to make a difference. We need to enable that workforce, and access to telehealth is more than the camera at the end, it's the enabling infrastructure. And again, we've got a satellite that is almost fully subscribed and for which the greatest step forward that we want to see in terms of using technology in our rural and remote communities is almost likely stoppered by some of the bandwidth issues that we have. Our other concern is affordability, and, you know, unless it's affordable and available to residents of rural communities, then we won't be able to access it. There was a very strong push, and this won't surprise you, about supporting the health and well-being of our workforce and the high levels of burnout which we see amongst all professions, particularly working in rural and very remote communities. So that recommendation was liked as much as many of the other foundational ones. So this is an area where, as a sector, we're obviously looking on, and we're part of a bigger picture, which is, you know, health professionals and their capacity of work-life balance, but it's absolutely at a pivotal point in rural communities where we have high levels of on-call, you know, less anonymity, and a whole lot of issues which make it often very difficult to create appropriate work-life balance. Finally, is research. And when I say finally, research, as we've heard over the last few days, is absolutely pivotal to making our situation better. So there have been some really good thoughts in the sharing shed around quarantining funding for rural and remote communities, for making sure that research is done with rural and remote communities, not on rural remote communities, and some very positive thoughts about investing in a clearinghouse, because what's been realised is that often rural researchers work in islands of excellence and they can't get critical mass and critical numbers to feature in some of our other very competitive funding rounds. So there's got to be a safe space where rural researchers actually get together and make the most of what they know and what they see on the ground, but connect at a level that gives them a way of managing their otherwise significant disadvantage. So thank you. There are, you know, another 180 in here. And I really encourage you, what we'll do is we'll do a bit better of sort of them, and please go in and see your recommendation in there. And as I said on the first day, this is an opportunity. This is a document that you can use, that you can say, this is not just my voice. When I went to a conference, there were 1,100 people. These were the recommendations were there. This is, you know, the voice of the sector. So thank you for the opportunity. It has been an opportunity for me to see and experience some of the good work and some of the fantastic thinking that is out there. And I look forward to seeing it harnessed to the future. Thank you.
Thanks for the abridged version of that, Jenny. Very important work. Okay, so it now gives me a lot of pleasure to welcome our next guest to the stage, Senator Bridget McKenzie. Bridget was born in rural Victoria in the small town of Alexandra. She was raised to be proud and passionate about regional Australia with the traditional rural influences of small business, sport and agriculture. Bridget's a bit of an overachiever, completing a double degree in applied science, specialising in human movement, and teaching, specialising in mathematics. She later went on to conduct research in physical activity with young women in rural settings. As the Minister for Regional Services and someone from a rural town, she understands and recognises the vital importance of access to 21st century communications, healthcare services and education. Please welcome her to the stage.
Well, great to be here, and doesn't Hobart look fantastic? I got very distracted on my way by looking out the window at that harbour with everyone else having fun on it. So hopefully after a big week at the conference, you'll be able to enjoy this fabulous city and a bit of the provenance from regional Tasmania before you head home. I love the title, Better Together. It encapsulates everything that every one of us that's working in this area right throughout the system is seeking to achieve. I'd first like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners on their land on whom we meet today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd also like to acknowledge the work of the National Rural Health Alliance, your board, Tanya Lehman, Chair, and Deputy Stephen, your council, your 37-member organisation, and all the health professionals and organisations, service providers, health educators, students here today and representatives. I'd also like to acknowledge Professor Paul Worley, the National Rural Health Commissioner. And Jenny, thank you very much for the 230 recommendations. I'm looking forward to perusing them in detail. And I think your comments around the resilience, the strength, the diversity and the inclusiveness, people think we're this homogenous place and space and people, they get quite challenged by the fact that we've been welcoming people to our communities from all backgrounds and places and spaces for a very long time. And as long as we all ruck in together and work hard and build fabulously strong, sustainable communities, that's what regional and rural Australia is all about. So thanks for those comments. I have had a quick look at some of the recommendations and I'll give you my thoughts post-speech. But I'd also like to thank Mark Diamond for putting on this conference and his tireless efforts to improve the health of rural and regional Australians through the Allied Health Professional Network since he's taken up the post in 2017. Today I want to talk to you about what the government has done over the past year and what is coming to get the balance right in rural health. And for me, it is by working better together. I want to say at the outset that those who don't know me, I'm very proud regional Australian. I just don't care about it because I've got the job of being Minister responsible for rural health, but I care very, very deeply about the sustainability of rural and regional Australia, our communities and our industries. I also happen to be Deputy Leader of the National Party. Being a rural Australian is part of my identity. And that doesn't matter where I live. That old saying, you can take the girl out of the country, but you can't take the country out of the girl, is very, very true. And I think it's great to see that place, where you come from, where the things that have impacted on your worldview and the adult that you become are very much based in the geography and the space and place that you grew up in. The nation has changed a lot in the time that I've been alive, nearly half a century, and for the most part, it's been very, very good. It's now time for a regeneration of rural and regional Australia. It's time to make living outside of the cities a positive mainstream choice. I too don't approach regional issues from a deficit perspective, and I think sometimes it is easy to fall into looking at where we live and the communities we serve in that regard. But it's time, I think, to flip that. As part of this, we must ensure that all 7 million of us who currently live in small towns or on the land don't have to settle for second-class health services and second-rate health outcomes. All Australians are equally deserving of high-quality health and medical care wherever they live, and our government is absolutely committed to ensuring that occurs. To achieve that goal, we have to get the balance right, and that's my topic for today. First, we need to get the balance right in the health system, and especially in the primary healthcare system. This is a problem right across the country, but it's especially important in rural Australia, where rates of chronic disease are higher and where there are challenges attracting and retaining fabulous domestically trained health professionals. We need to correct the imbalance between episodic and crisis care and preventative health and health promotion, the management of care. Quality modern healthcare recognises that people's health and well-being is complex. It requires many players to care for the whole person, not just your local GP. Doctors do play a critical role, but so do our nurses, our pharmacists, our dentists, and the many, many allied health professionals. The second area we need to find better balance is in the division of access to healthcare between Australians living out in rural and regional Australia and those in our major cities. When I travel around regional Australia, I see that these communities out in the regions are actually the engine rooms of our nation. I see an agricultural sector leading the way with new farming methods. I see mining industry driving our exports, and I see a food and wine industry that is winning plaudits around the world. Millions of Australians are employed in regional primary production. These industries make up 70% of our nation's exports, and as the chair of the CSIRO said recently, we've had 25 years of unprecedented growth in this country, and you know what's driven it? It's not Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane, it's regional and rural Australia. It's rural and regional Australia. So the evidence is clear that we are the backbone of our economy, as I told the National Press Club last week, and so therefore we shouldn't be having to beg, yell, scream, campaign at the rate we do to get the recognition from government and communities of getting access to rural and regional health service provisions. The ongoing shortage of doctors and other health professionals in rural areas is something that we have taken very, very seriously as a government during the last 5 years. For our Australians living out amongst us, there are 302 full-time equivalent doctors, including specialists, for every 100,000 people. By comparison, those that live in our capital cities have 453 full-time equivalent doctors per 100,000 people. That is a significant difference. We've got enough doctors, we've got enough specialists. Unfortunately, they're all living and practicing in the wrong places. So we've actually tried to really wrestle as one of the major things we've done over the past 5 years to readdressing that imbalance. That's how we handed down the $550 million Stronger Rural Health Strategy last budget, and it's a 10-year plan that will transform our rural health workforce, particularly with respect to GPs, but it does go to allied health professionals over the coming years, because we actually recognise that there's two key things that will determine whether you think living and growing, practicing and having a rewarding, successful career in the regions is a good thing. One of them, are you like me? Did you grow up there? So you had a great time. Your family, it was a great place to grow up and live, so you don't approach it with that deficit model, or you spent a significant part of your training out in the regions. And so what we've done under the Stronger Rural Health Strategy is actually flip the model for a certain proportion of our doctor training where they are. We are training them out in the regions. We are selecting students that don't have an inherent bias towards practicing in the regions. Now that will result in over 3,000 GPs out in country communities over the coming decade, 3,000 additional nurses and allied health professionals. There is more to be done, and that is why I called the specialists, the colleges, the accreditation bodies to Canberra in November last year. I said, right, we're on a pathway, we're on a journey here with our GPs. When are you coming on board with us? When are you coming on that journey? Why can you only do specialist training in capital city hospitals? Why don't you recognise that out in regional communities, they may be regional capitals, there's some great models of training and development that can occur that you could accredit. So we're going on a journey with the specialists, with the allied health professionals, recognising that once RAGCP and ACRM had their historic agreement, we could begin the hard work of creating the rural generalist pathway and program, that the next step was to make sure that rural generalism is something that allied health professions examined. And so the very next Rural Health Roundtable I convened, I think it was August last year, I'm looking at Alex, Paul's nodding yes, but in the second Rural Health roundtable that I was chairing, unfortunately it was day of the spill, so I wasn't able to make it in person, so thanks for everyone that rocked up, was to focus on how do we get a similar pathway up and running for allied health professionals, because the 21st century model of care is multidisciplinary. We do deliver better outcomes for all our patients, especially those in rural and regional Australia with the increased complexity and chronic conditions, when we work better together as part of a multidisciplinary team. And the allied health professionals are key to making that occur. In terms of the National Rural Generalist, today I'm pleased to announce that the Australian Government will be investing more than $62.2 million over the next 4 years as the first step towards funding the national pathway. This funding, thank you. This funding will support improved training coordination for rural generalists and an expansion of primary care training for our junior doctors. The government will also contribute funding for GP colleges to apply for subspecialty recognition for rural generalists. And this measure commences implementation on specific reforms recommended by our National Rural Health Commissioner and follows through on our 2016 commitment to implement the pathway. And I'd like to acknowledge Professor Paul Worley for your immense dedication and passion that you've brought to this task, and to all the health professionals out in rural and regional Australia that have actually focused on getting what will be transformative for our communities going forward to get this pathway up and running. We've got new GP visa requirements because we're serious about taking practical steps to better distribute doctors between urban centres and our rural communities. And we've got the Murray-Darling Basin Medical School Network, which I'm particularly proud of, because if it wasn't for the Nationals in government, this flipping the model of medical training in this country, basing it in the region end to end, selecting students for place, would not actually be occurring. And we know that Wagga Wagga, Dubbo, Orange, Bendigo, Mildura and Shepparton will have facilities from a range of universities and partners that will be delivering that GP workforce and creating a network that really is innovative and I think is foundational for a model we can use. It's also building on a lot of the work done by James Cook, a lot of the work done by Charles Sturt University, in how they've actually been supplying a really rich level of allied health professional to rural and regional communities by selecting for place and for training end to end in the regions. Doesn't mean Dubbo and Orange are overflowing with allied health professionals. What we do know is they won't necessarily go back to that place. They'll pick another regional town because they know it's a great place to live and work and have a rewarding career. While the majority of training under that program will soon occur in the regions, we know that more student doctors will choose to remain rural when they graduate, and the flow-on benefits will be significant. We've also expanded opportunities to obtain healthcare remotely using video technology, and I've had two amazing experiences, personal experiences with that, not as a patient, but just watching our fabulous rural health workforce in action. One was out at Moranbah Hospital, an ED with 2 beds. Farmer Joe comes in, not real name, Farmer Joe comes in with a stake through his leg that he's been fencing all day, and they phone into Brisbane, and this nursing staff actually have him completely stabilised before the helicopter arrives so he can be transferred. Now, without the telehealth services, without that sort of interoperability and the connectivity, and I completely agree with you in terms of the enabling infrastructure, one of my other hats is as Regional Communications Minister. It is absolutely crucial to get that right, and we've just announced an additional $220 million for digital connectivity last Wednesday for precisely this issue, because it is life-saving for our communities. And I know when I was up with the RFDS, and they were telling me a story about how that connectivity was able to have them connected to another man on station, 3 a.m. in the morning, very concerning mental health issues, thinking about taking his own life, and they were able to hook him into a specialist in Brisbane who was able to be with him one-on-one on the phone until physical assistance could arrive through the RFDS. Now, we're actually saving people's lives through this technology, and I think it's really, really powerful, and it's something that I don't think will ever replace human beings at the forefront, and nor should we, of healthcare. But for those, particularly in the very far remote-flung places of our country, it serves an incredible service. And the RFDS themselves provided almost 22,000 episodes of dental care and 13,500 mental health consultations through their work. And we've been supporting them with an additional $90 million over the last year. Thank you. No, thank you, honestly. Wherever we go out in the regions, RFDS is the way to go. So let's now focus on the other areas where we need to get the balance right, and it is about providing multidisciplinary teams that can meet our 21st century health needs. And that's now why we're actually trying to reach agreement, and we need to make sure we get that balance right. It's not the government's role to tell health professionals their business, but we can certainly discuss the evidence and bring people to the table, exactly what this conference is doing. And so I will be sitting down with those recommendations and examining how they can feed into my thoughts as the Minister responsible for rural health in how we can get the balance right and keep building on the work we've already done and the focus we've already done. Around 1/4 of Australians' health workforce comprise of allied health professionals, and your work is incredibly central to people's health and well-being, particularly those in rural and regional communities. But it isn't easy, as you all know, for economies of scales. It's very hard to run a business as a physiotherapist, a dietitian, a dentist, an occupational therapist, a psychologist in a small rural town. And I think we need to have a system that recognises that. Now, how we do that, I think, is part of this conference's work and recommendations to me and obviously to state ministers as well. I'm open to new ideas, and I've asked the National Rural Health Commissioner to work with all stakeholders to develop advice on improving the quality, distribution and access of allied health services across rural and remote Australia. Now that he's got so much free time that we're kicking on with the Rural Generalist pathway for GPs, that is, as Minister, he's an independent kind of guy. He's the Commissioner. But I can ask him the next piece of work that I would like his office and himself to focus on is the next tranche of reforms, and it is around the allied health workforce into rural and regional Australia, and I know he'll have a lot more to say about that. But I'm very pleased that he'll be able to focus on that now that that work that he's done on the GP pathway is complete. Together with these two pieces of work from the Commissioner, we will be able to get the balance right, getting the right team with the right skills in the right place to provide the right care for every Australian, not just those in capital cities. So you'll hear a lot more about that from Professor Worley. Just wanted to briefly touch on the Workforce Incentive Program. While the Commissioner works with the sector over coming months, and I think he'll be reporting back to me in October, all things going well, back to me in October this year with his piece of work around allied health. The Workforce Incentive Program will merge and streamline all existing GP, nursing and allied health rural incentive programs. And just under $182 million in additional funding has been allocated to what we're going to call the WIP for 4 years. This includes funding for nursing and eligible allied health professionals as part of the new Workforce Incentive Program stream that better targets and addresses the actual workforce needs of specific geographic areas. Practices will receive incentives to employ nurses, allied health professionals, including non-dispensing pharmacists and Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander health workers. It will promote team-based multidisciplinary care of the kind needed by a growing number of Australians with chronic and complex conditions. Nurses and nurse practitioners will also be given a stronger role in frontline care, easing pressures on doctors and ensuring patients receive the right care when they actually need it. The nursing workforce will be strengthened through training and support for nurses moving into general practice and a review of the current curricula. We're providing $8.3 million from July last year to the Australian Primary Care Nurses Association to deliver training and support nurses to move into general practice. Regional and rural healthcare providers are also encouraged to increase the role of nurses in delivering care, and an awareness campaign will increase the profile and use of qualified nurse practitioners. This month, we commenced consultations for the independent review of nursing education announced in last year's budget. And I understand that a workshop was conducted at this conference on Sunday with some very, very good feedback on rural issues. So thank you for those who participated in that. The review is being led by Professor Schwartz and is the first independent review of Australian nursing preparation since 2002. So a lot's changed. You couldn't download Netflix anywhere in 2002. So a lot's changed in our society and how we deliver healthcare and what we know. So I know this review into nurses' curricula will be incredibly useful for all of us. It'll be focused on to consider how the education and preparation of nurses in Australia will ensure that our workforce is well placed to meet the future needs of our communities and our health system, because it's constantly evolving, as are the health needs of our communities. So it's an exceptional opportunity for the profession, service providers, educators, and those who work with nurses more generally, such as yourselves, to have input into this system. There'll be face-to-face consultations around Australia, right across both metropolitan and rural and regional areas from April until June, and also the opportunity to submit written submissions. I'll be getting a report in August this year. And I just wanted to briefly mention pharmacists. As a young mum of way too many children in a small country town, under 5,000 for most of my life, my local pharmacist was the front line of healthcare, because back then, it was very expensive to take one sick kid and then 4 of them off to the doctor. There wasn't bulk billing available in my regional community. So the pharmacist was always my first place of call. And I think they are well placed in a lot of rural communities to expand their role in healthcare, and the government's committed to encouraging this. I think we're ensuring the viability and the prosperity of the community with the pharmacy sector, which are key in ensuring access to prescription medicine across the whole nation, but also great advice. I also received my own immunisation last autumn at my local pharmacist, because I didn't have time or couldn't get into the local doctor. So again, serving a great community need there, and I do think there's an increased role they can play. The 2017 compact between the Pharmacy Guild and the government includes redesigned community pharmacy programs, the dose administration aids program, etc. I'm sure you're all aware of what they are doing in your local communities. There are also a number of trials underway for new pharmacy professional services. And just this month, the Health Minister announced a new $5 million trial in which pharmacists will help people with mental illness manage their medications, which I think is a really useful use of the pharmacist's expertise. Pharmacists taking part in the trial will receive training and will work closely with other health professionals in caring for those patients. The primary goal is better medication adherence and management, but it'll also increase the patient's quality of life. All of these measures will result in doctors working more closely with other health professionals, including nurses, physios, psychologists and pharmacists. When care is well balanced, it works for the most important person in the picture, the person we're all here, including myself, to assist, and that is the person in rural and regional Australia needing healthcare, needing to make sure they're well. As you may have heard yesterday, and this is the bit I was very excited when we announced it in budget, and it sounds like all the widgets and wadgets have come together, and our Heads Up tool is a very exciting tool that will actually assist us to understand our workforce in a lot better way than we've been able to do thus far. For the first time, we'll be able to provide a single source of quality data on the health workforce and how the community uses our health services across 829 new GP catchment areas. And I think that's for government, that's going to be a really powerful tool on how we focus and fund and assess how Australians are interacting with the health system and where the gaps are. So looking ahead, the government will continue to fine-tune our policies for rural and regional health in line with new ideas, importantly new evidence and new international experience. This conference has brought a lot of those factors together, which it makes it very important for you, but very important also for myself. Truly appreciate the work of the NRHA, not just here but every day, which is why we've announced continued funding support over the next 3 years from 2019 to 20. Right now, I'm proud of the progress that has been made over the past few years in restoring the balance in rural health, our transformative rural health workforce package, the most transformative package in 3 decades, and I'm confident there is more work to be done, and it is with your sector, and I'm very much looking forward to going on that journey with you. We've laid the foundations down for a strong future, set the priorities, we've provided the funding, and we've delivered. It's about careful and considered reforms that will produce long-term lasting change that is actually needed. We're making them. I'm just really excited what we've been able to do, because one of my other hats is Minister for Decentralisation. And if you ask what is actually going to get Australians living out in our communities, yes, it's access to a local jobs, and for me that's one of the key determinants of health, right, is poverty. And that means having vibrant local communities where you and your loved ones can actually have meaningful work. So that is an important part. Yes, it is about being connected, but it is also, and all the research and data from the Business Council of Australia to, what you guys know, is that is having access to high quality, domestically trained healthcare is a key determinant of being in the regions, and also high quality education outcomes. So that's the sort of stuff that I'm working on in other places and spaces, but thank you very much for your time today. I think we've made real progress. It's great to see the Labor Party agrees, and we look forward to joining with you on the next chapter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. That was fantastic. I would now like to welcome our next speaker to the stage, Emeritus Professor Paul Worley. Paul is Australia's first National Rural Health Commissioner, appointed a little over a year ago at the end of 2017. He studied medicine at the University of Adelaide, graduating in 1984. He was in a solo rural practice in Lameroo, in the Murray-Mallee region of South Australia, and then moved to a group rural practice at Clare, a wine growing area in the mid-north of the state, and that seems to make sense if there's good wine there. In 1992, Paul was elected the President of the Rural Doctors Association of South Australia, and in 1994 he took up an appointment as Senior Lecturer in Rural Health at Flinders University in South Australia. Interestingly enough, Paul is the only Fellow of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences to have won the local tennis championship in Lameroo. So please welcome him to the stage.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here in Palawa Land, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of this land, as well as acknowledging that for my family this is somewhat of a homecoming as well, because a couple of 100 years ago my great-great-great-grandfather, or one of my great-great-great-grandfathers, came here on His Majesty's pleasure and formed a family which subsequently has been part of what we now call Australia. I mention those two acknowledgements because we can learn from both. We certainly can learn from Indigenous Australia and Indigenous Australians, their understanding of health, a holistic understanding which includes the biopsychosocial-spiritual understanding, the connection to country. We may call it a connection to place. But that has so much to inform us and teach us in our models of care and our models of training. And I hope that the work that my office has been doing over this last year has acknowledged that fully in the way we have been attempting to set up country-based, place-based training systems for people who live and work in the country. The other part of my introduction acknowledges that much of our health system, in fact much of our economic development over the last couple of centuries, is due to people who have come from elsewhere to make Australia their home. And I again thank God for the number of overseas trained doctors and other health professionals who have chosen to work in our rural and remote communities where our domestic graduates have not gone. Our communities would not be the same without you. I was asked to take this position on in 2017 as an initiative of the National Party and an initiative of the Parliament with bipartisan support through legislation was given till the middle of 2020 to define rural generalism and to develop a national rural generalist pathway. With the collaboration of a large number of people across the country last year, we ended up being 18 months ahead of that agenda item. And hence, the Minister, as she informed you previously, has asked me to look at what was always going to be important, the fact that rural health is a team sport. And there's no point in focusing on one member of the team when we're not looking at the whole of the team. So this year, to look at how those same principles, looking at quality, looking at distribution, looking at access, can be applied to the equally important allied health workforce across regional, rural and remote Australia. It has been wonderful to be working with the peak bodies across Australia in allied health this year, and I look forward to continuing to work with them as we develop recommendations for government to be delivered in October this year. I have also been struck in what I have learnt by the similarities in terms of the issues that confront the allied health professionals of rural Australia to what I learnt and worked with last year in the rural medical space. And I'd like to acknowledge what I have learnt by relating to a number of women who have inspired me as I've met them around the country. I deliberately pick women because women are the majority of our health workforce. They are the majority of our health graduates. And yet our models of training, our models of care, our models of service, unfortunately, in many ways, relate to an older time, a time when the majority of health professionals were a bit like me, pale, male and stale. And we need to look forward, and we can learn from the pathfinders. So can I start with a woman who has been an inspiration for me for a number of years, has started as a social worker and moved to a university because she saw the opportunity to expand from being a single provider of care to being a trainer of people who can provide care. As an Aboriginal woman, she has also recognised that there needs to be particular approaches to enabling Aboriginal kids to come through the various education sectors to be able to become allied health, medical or nursing professionals. Kylie Stothers is based in Katherine, and she is now working with IHARS, working with AMSANT, working with her local community on an Indigenous academy for Indigenous kids in that region to be able to work through the various levels of education to achieve becoming part of the health workforce. It's interprofessional, and so should all of our education be across rural Australia. And it's led by people in country, as all of our health professions education for rural Australia ought to be. We can no longer rely on the trickle out from our cities. As the Minister said, we need to take the grasp of this responsibility ourselves, train in country for country. Kylie Stothers in Katherine. Another woman who really drove home to me the changes that we need is Caroline Mooney. Many of you here will know the Mooney name. especially if you've been to Australia's oldest western settlement that is not a capital city, Georgetown, a little way north of here. Is that Tim over there? It is, yes. And you'll probably know Caroline's father, Tim, who was one of the supervisors of the year, I think about 6 years ago, something like that. I mention Caroline for two reasons. One, because she is so different to her dad. She has a job that will never be the same as her father's job. It will never be the same as the job that I trained for, where we trained to be in one place, stay in that place, look after everything in that place. That is no longer the rural health jobs of the future. The jobs of the future are networked jobs across regions. And so Caroline works in different locations in her region, using her rural generalist skills in different ways in different locations, and constructing a job that works for her as a woman, works for her practice, and works for her region. She can do that because of collaboration. It is hard though, because the systems are still based around individual towns competing rather than collaborating. But the jobs we need to create are jobs where people like Caroline can work in a region across sectors and across geography, whether that be medicine, allied health or nursing. The other reason I mention Caroline is, of course, she was brought up in the town she's now practicing. More evidence of that return on investment that we get when we enable rural kids to have access to education to become rural health professionals. Yes, there are going to be people like myself who was trained in the city and who spent the majority of their childhood in the city who choose to go rural as a vocation. But that does not account for the pool of geography, the pool of place, the pool of family, as our Aboriginal mentors would tell us, the pool of country. And that pool of country is evident in Caroline's life, as it is in many rural doctors and rural allied health professionals' life. So we have to enable rural kids to be able to get into our training programs and base it around that well-known knowledge. In the middle of Victoria, there's a physiotherapist who, recognising that she only had two hands and could therefore only treat a limited number of patients as a physio, thought, well, perhaps there's a way of getting greater influence through having an understanding of public health, an understanding of policy. That then led her to realise, actually, there's not enough evidence to base all of that policy on. We need good data, we need good evidence. We need research that is based in rural communities for rural communities. Belinda O'Sullivan has been working with me in the Commissioner's office, a rural physiotherapist who now is leading research that is informing the WHO on rural pathways for health workforce across the developing world. That is being led from rural Australia. That is not being led from a city of 10 million people. That is being led from a regional centre. We need people in rural Australia to be able to engage in research, just as people in the health services in our cities engage in research, teaching and clinical practice, and their patients get the benefits of all of that. Belinda is an example of how, as a health professional, we need to encourage people to take on that research arm of their profession so that we can create an evidence base that works for us. And as a wealthy country, use that evidence base to inform others around the world. Pat Miller is a woman who has inspired me for decades in Central Australia. She is not a doctor. She is not a health professional. She happens to run politically for us to succeed, academically for us to succeed in health service delivery. we must listen to our community. We must engage with our community and be accountable to that community. Listening to Pat is like listening to bottled wisdom. And I'm sure you all have Pats in your regional centres and regional towns. Let's ensure that our systems actually engage with the community in the same way that we as clinicians respect what our patients bring to us in our healing environments. Can I mention a couple of others? Adelaide Mitke. Who's ever heard of Adelaide Mitke? I thought so. We talk about technology as being important in health care delivery, and absolutely it is as an adjunct to the people-based healthcare that we need to have. But this is not a new thing. Adelaide was the founder of the School of the Air. She, in collaboration with the RFDS based in Alice Springs, Adelaide was based in Adelaide, strange, developed an education process that enabled kids on remote stations to attain the same level of education as if they had access to a local primary and high school. We have a lot to learn from Adelaide. She did this over 100 years ago. It is not new, but it is still absolutely profound and absolutely crucial to the future of our service delivery and our education delivery. At one time, people had to come to the cities in order to be able to train, because that's where the libraries were. The libraries are now here. And we know that the ingredients for education, which are experience and wisdom in supervision, are present all across our wide brown land. There is no longer any excuse for our education processes to be based around city campuses. They can be distributed, as Adelaide Mitke said, and put into practice. And they can get the results that we have demonstrated again and again through university departments of rural health and rural clinical schools. The last person that I would like to mention is a dietitian from rural South Australia who recognised that if you look at the main reason that clinicians leave in a crisis, and I've heard this again and again, it's when there's been a communication breakdown between management and the clinicians. It's inside of us, it's inside the team. It's not external things, it's inside the team. And so the future of our health service requires that more of us gain expertise in leadership, in health service administration, and actually take that step to the dark side and get involved in leadership. So I want to acknowledge what I've learned from Tanya Lehman, a dietitian in the Riverland who has taken that step to become a leader as a dietitian of a multidisciplinary team, of a health service that encompasses us all, and a person who's recognised that that leadership can be local and can be national in the field of this alliance. So I think of one of my patients, Jenny, a lady who suffers from intergenerational trauma. She is not Indigenous. It comes to us all. A lady who has chronic multiple illnesses that require the highest level of technical innovation and the most basic connection at a human level to work with. And yet, being only an hour and a half away, which is where my practice is, from where a lot of that expertise is, when she is unwell, she cannot access care. Yes, it's an easy road to travel if you're well and if everything is right, but when you're crook, she just said to me the other day, "Look, I'm sorry, I can't get there." And I said to her, "I think you're making the right decision. And I'm sorry that they can't get here, that they can't be here with you." If we look at the gap in mortality between remote Australia and the cities, there's a 1.3 difference. 1.3 difference. What does that mean? Remote Australia, about 500,000 people. That means that every year there are about 200,000 people. There is an excess mortality of about 200,000 in remote Australia. That is a large number. We are not talking about little bits and pieces. In the time of this conference, another 12 of those people have died. And we are not dealing with a system that has no strength or resilience in order to respond. I hope with the examples I've given you that we have people that we can look to guide our way forward. I could have mentioned the people who have led colleges, the women who are in leadership in our political systems who are actually taking things forward, the wives and partners of us all who have supported those who have done things for rural Australia. But I choose today to honour the women who have inspired us, the women of this generation past and of this generation future, who will, working together, take rural health forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Okay, our next presenter has travelled a long, long way to be with us here today. Jill Sonk is Director of the Centre for Arts in Medicine at the University of Florida and Assistant Director of University Florida Health, Shands Arts in Medicine in the US. With 25 years of experience in leadership in arts and health, Jill is active in research, teaching and international cultural exchange. Please give her a warm welcome to the stage.
Thank you. I want to thank the organizers of the conference, and particularly Kelly Drummond-Cawthon, who has brought the arts forward in such a beautiful way over the past 3 days, for inviting me here. And I'd also like to add my acknowledgement and pay my respects to the original and traditional owners of this land upon which we gather, and their elders past, present, and emerging. As a visitor, I share with this place a deep respect for arts and culture. And I'm going to talk this afternoon about those things, looking specifically at the question, can the arts help us live longer and be healthier as we age? I want to begin by introducing you to Anna Halprin, who is a pioneer of modern dance in America. She's spent her life dancing, and as you see her here, she is today 98 years old and still dancing. And she's a beautiful example of how the arts can help us thrive throughout our lives. And there are many of these examples represented today in a rapidly growing body of literature that links the arts to health, both at the individual and collective levels. But what I'd like to talk about this afternoon is population level health. We know that the arts are good for us as individuals. Many of us in this room probably dose ourselves with arts and music all the time, right? You get home from work, turn music on. We're familiar with this relationship. But what can we know about the arts and population level health, and how can we engage the arts and culture to help build more healthier and more thriving communities in our nations? So thinking this afternoon about general population level health, not just artists who engage the arts for their lives, but everyone, people who may not be specialists in the arts. So this question has been asked for a long time. Researchers in Sweden started thinking about this question in the 1980s. Bygren and his colleagues began a study in the early 1980s, a longitudinal large cohort study looking at over 15,000 people to determine whether engagement in arts and culture could have life-extending implications. They controlled for all of the variables that we might expect to control for, and they found that indeed people who engaged in arts and cultural activities did live longer, and that outcome was attributed not to education, socioeconomic status, location, but to the effects of the arts on the immune system. They followed that study 14 years later, looking at the same cohort and specifically looking at higher mortality risk for people who rarely visited cinema, concerts, museums, or arts exhibits. And those benefits were not applicable to all sorts of arts and cultural engagement, but they did determine that participation in some forms of arts and culture participation can affect longevity. They followed that study again in the 1990s, asking the question, do changes in cultural participation as we age impact our health and our longevity, and found that indeed 65% increase in the risk of impaired perceived health among those who reduced their activity in arts and culture. So this kind of work set the stage for population-level inquiry of the effects of the arts on health. And today in the UK, there's some really exciting data coming forward that I just want to share with you briefly. There's a very big data set that's being looked at now that comes from two major data sets, the English Longitudinal Study of Aging and the 1970 British Cohort Study. Some of you may be familiar with this. The latter is a study in which in 1970, over 1 week, every baby born in the UK in that week was consented to this longitudinal study. So these people are studied like crazy every year. And among the many tests that they undergo every year, there are over 300 questions related to arts and cultural participation. So we know a lot about the arts and cultural habits of the people engaged in this cohort. And I want to acknowledge Daisy Fancourt, who's a statistical epidemiologist in the Institute of Epidemiology and Healthcare at the University College London, and her team who are undertaking these studies. They are controlling rigorously for the kind of socioeconomic factors that Bygren and his team also controlled for in their studies, and they are finding truly compelling outcomes. They're looking at, again, independent of demographic health and social confounders, they found that cultural participation actually predicts changes in cognitive function in older adults over a 10-year period of time. Specifically that visiting museums, galleries, and exhibitions, and going to theater, concerts, and opera are associated with lesser cognitive decline, or rather lesser decline in cognitive function, and that adults aged 50 and older who visit museums just every few months or more have a lower incidence of dementia over the same 10-year period. So if you look at this depicted, you can see very, again, compelling outcomes for those who go to galleries and museums and those who attend theater and concerts just monthly or more. There are very significant protective effects against loss of memory. Unfortunately, that's not so with cinema, as you can see here, but attending other cultural events has a very high level of protective effect against loss in memory. Similarly, semantic function. We see significant protective effects among those who go just monthly or more to concerts and museums. Again, not so with cinema here. Interestingly, these protective effects for memory and semantic function and cognitive decline are greater for those who go to museums or concerts just once a month or more than they are for people who exercise 3 times a week. So these are very compelling findings. Similarly, Fancourt and her team are looking at museums and dementia, finding a 44% lower risk for dementia among people who visit museums just every few months. Fancourt and her team are also looking at depression and aging, finding a dose-response relationship between frequency of cultural engagement and risk of developing depression, again controlling for a range of socio-demographic factors, with 32% lower risk of depression among those who attend every few months, and 48% lower risk among those who attend once a month or more. They're also looking at children and maladjustment in children, which is a significant determinant of health at all, and comparing children who show little, some, or marked creativity in their activities, and finding that among those who show some creativity, a 22% lower risk of maladjustment, and those who show marked creativity have a 50% lower risk for maladjustment. These findings continue across quite a few domains. You'll find quite a bit of literature coming out in 2018 and 2019, showing very similar findings around frailty, loneliness, chronic pain, incidence of disability, cognitive decline, postnatal depression, and, like Bygren and his team, around mortality, finding that people who engage in the arts actually live longer. So there is a trend toward this type of investigation. We're seeing around the world an upsurge in studies that are developing indicators for associating arts and cultural participation and well-being at the community and population level. Again, Fancourt's work is looking at causation, cause and effect around arts and cultural participation, and these indicators projects are associating, and a few of them are here in Australia, which is very interesting. So we've got quite a bit of evidence, quite a bit of really compelling evidence to suggest that engagement in the arts is good for us, helps us live longer, helps us thrive as we age. Why are we not seeing more policy yet around this evidence? Well, it's actually emerging. There is quite a bit happening. You might be aware of social prescribing, which is a notion that's being taken up around the world, most notably in the UK. The work that Fancourt has done over these past years has driven a significant upsurge in social prescribing. That's a structure through which caregivers, care providers, can prescribe arts and social activities, and in the UK, the National Health Service is actually paying for people to participate in these activities as a way to enhance their health and to prevent the incidence of disease. In the UK, in January, they just hired 1,000 more link workers. These are people who serve as referrers. They connect the people to whom arts and cultural participation has been prescribed with local services. And that UK health system is seeing significant outcomes and impacts. In fact, Fancourt and her team have documented that in the past 2 decades, every time there's been a £1 reduction in investment in the arts nationally, 4 additional pounds have been needed to be invested for the health budget. So there's a very clear economic implication for arts and cultural participation in the UK as well. Canada has also taken up social prescribing, and physicians are prescribing trips to museums for patients. And here in Australia, there are actually 2 schemes for social and green prescribing coming out of both Sydney and Melbourne. So there's really an upsurge in this approach. And this reflects as well the focus that we've been hearing so much about over the past 3 days on the social determinants of health. Recognizing that 90% of health happens in communities and that culture itself is a very significant determinant of health. Many estimate 40 to 50% as a determinant of health. And we're largely looking at these determinants of health more in the context of communities, so a collective view of the social determinants of health, and putting the social determinants of health in the context of health equity and disparities of power, racism, and collective trauma of epigenetics, and in the context of social exclusion and isolation. And the arts are being used widely to address these circumstances. In the United States today, our public health sector is thinking and talking about a fifth wave of public health that follows on the notion of the social determinants of health and focuses on the collective influences and actions for health. So again, looking at a more collective level in regard to the social determinants of health. And I just want to bring forward here a very articulate view from the Helicon Corporation collaboration in the United States, that arts and culture is a tangible vehicle through which individuals and communities form culture in the anthropological sense, beliefs, identities, worldviews, and values. And it's through culture that we interpret and make meaning from our experiences, including traumatic ones. It's through culture that we most profoundly and empathetically connect with other people, both like us and those who are unfamiliar. And cultural practices help build social connections that make communities vibrant and resilient. So arts and culture shine a light on problems and unsettle the status quo, providing new ways of seeing and being in the world and easing the process of change. I'll return to those notions in just a few minutes, but I'd like to share with you an initiative that's happening in the United States right now. We were asked at the University of Florida Center for Arts and Medicine about a year ago to head up a national initiative to formally expand the intersections between the arts and public health in America. We were invited to lead this initiative by ArtPlace America, which is an entity that was created by about 25 of the largest philanthropies, federal agencies, and banks in America to enhance the arts and community building in the United States and to address health and well-being. So this initiative, in shorthand, is about making arts in public health a thing. In the United States and in much of the world, the arts in health care is a very familiar notion. In the United States, we have arts programs now at more than half of hospitals. So the health care sector has really embraced the idea that the arts make the healthcare experience better and improve outcomes at the individual level from a sociobiological context. But the public health sector, which has used the arts in many ways throughout its history, hasn't formally engaged in the same way that healthcare has. So our shorthand again is that we're here to make arts in public health a thing in the United States. So it's a cross-sector initiative with 4 primary components: discovery, collaboration, translation, and dissemination. And I'll touch briefly on each of those and note that we also are working largely in the context of using the arts for well-being and for health communication. So in this initiative, we're gathering knowledge. We've planned and undertaken 6 already of 9 national convenings. We've convened over 250 invited individuals, practitioners, thought leaders, researchers, educators from the fields of public health, arts and culture, and community development. We've focused those working group convenings on practice, policy, research, and on equity. And we've taken the proceedings of each of those events and we've analyzed them thematically, and we consider them data sets. That data is combined with the other elements of our research and discovery, including a national field survey that we undertook over the past several months, focus groups that we've conducted all around the country to talk with public health professionals using the arts, artists working in public health, and participants in those programs. We've also conducted a scoping review of the literature and are just launching a systematic review. Our goal is to do the heavy lifting on behalf of the field, to do that difficult work of figuring out how to consolidate the literature, of developing search terms and search strategies, and of consolidating and assessing the literature so that others can work forward from what's known in the field. There's a question mark over meta-analysis there because we don't think there's actually enough strength and consistency in the literature yet for meta-analyses, but we're hoping that through this work we will be able to offer recommendations for core outcomes that will begin to strengthen that evidence base and build greater statistical power for our understanding of the arts and public health. This is for us a translational initiative. We intend to take the knowledge and research that we're gathering and translate it into practice and policy. And we're doing that through the development of a number of resources. Just last week, we hosted our national working group of thought leaders who have created the first draft of a white paper, which we'll be publishing in June. So that group took into consideration the scoping review, field survey, focus groups, and proceedings data, recognizing that much of this, and this is an issue that's significant for us today, when we look at the literature today in a moment of such radical change in our understanding of community-based health promotion, we see the past. We see evidence that's been published in the past 4 or 5 years, but that really comes from work that's been done even prior to that. So we recognize that in looking at the literature, we look at the past. We're combining that view, which is not unimportant, with views of the present that we're gathering from these other methods, and combining that with the visions of thought leaders that we're gathering to create recommendations for the future. We're creating a whole array of deliverables, of resources, the white paper, which will be published in June. We'll follow that with a governmental advisory brief and a concept brief, several peer-reviewed publications, and ultimately an evidence-based framework that can be used to guide best practice in engaging the arts in public health. I want to note also that the World Health Organization is thinking about arts and culture, and in May, you'll see a beautiful report forthcoming called Cultural Contexts of Health, the Role of Arts in Improving Health and Well-Being in the WHO European region. So this idea of building the intersections between the arts, public health, and community development is really growing throughout the world. This is an exciting moment in regard to recognition of arts and culture as really primary assets. And I'd like to invite you in closing to consider arts and culture in the work that you're doing in rural and regional communities in Australia, recognizing that they're assets for engaging with communities, they're assets for thinking about the issues in communities, and their asset-based approaches to both understanding and collaboratively addressing the determinants of health that we've been talking about over the past 3 days. I say that in clear recognition that in many of the rural communities you all are working in, there are arts deserts. There's a lack of infrastructure for formal arts engagement, but in those communities, there is a wealth of resources, a wealth of creativity, a wealth of interest in the arts and in creative engagement that can be garnered for building healthier and stronger communities in rural and regional Australia. So thank you for your attention this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Jill. Actually, I was really interested in listening to that. My dad's an artist and he steered me well and truly towards health. If you know an artist, they'll get it. All right, our final presentation is someone I've heard speak before, and you might be familiar with from his role in a TV show. Dr. Sandro De Mayo, trained and worked as a doctor before completing a Master in Public Health, including fieldwork in Cambodia. In 2010, he completed a PhD with the University of Copenhagen, focusing on non-communicable diseases. His doctoral research was based in Mongolia. He held a postdoctoral fellowship at Harvard Medical School from 2013 to 2015, and more recently, from 2015 to April last year, he was the medical officer for non-communicable diseases, conditions, and nutrition with the Department of Nutrition for Health and Development at the global headquarters of the WHO. Also in April 2018, he became the Chief Executive Officer of EAT, which is an awesome acronym, a science-based global platform for food systems transformation. Later on last year, and funded through his media work with ABC TV, and Pan Macmillan Publishers, Sandro established an independent, not-for-profit foundation focused on improving the health and nutrition of Australians. You may know him more recently as co-hosting the ABC television show Ask the Doctor, an innovative and exploratory factual media series broadcasting every week throughout Australia. Please welcome him to the stage.
Hi everyone. I too would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land we meet on today and their elders past, present and emerging. This is my second time to Hobart, or to Tasmania in fact. It's kind of shocking as a Melburnian. But I'm always surprised and in a way kind of bewildered by the incredible beauty of Hobart and of this part of the world. And it reminds me of the thousands of years of stewardship and respect that Aboriginal people from this country showed for this land, and that we need to continue to work to understand and to emulate. I also want to thank the organisers of this conference. It's been a pleasure to work with Tanya, Leanne and everyone else. It's a bit of a hard job to come at the end of a multi-day conference and say something new, but also in a way reflect back on everything we've learnt over the last few days and try and synthesise it down into 35 or 40 minutes, but also add maybe some new reflections from my own experience and my work abroad. So growing up, most of you probably don't know this, but it was actually always my dream to be a rural GP. Inspired by my dad, who is a true GP consultant, a doctor, mentor and a leader in his community, my community, and my mum, who's an occupational therapist and a long-time community advocate, I had visions of living in a small country town and opening my own clinic one day. I had the pleasure of working briefly in Mount Isa and Longreach as a medical student, and was set on moving back there one day and joining the mentors who were so generous to me. Driven by knowledge of the social and health impact that is possible through highest quality rural healthcare, the medical practice that I had grown up with, learning and watching from with my father, I too wanted to shape community wellbeing, guide families through the most difficult life transitions, support vulnerable members of my community, and bring comfort to the lives of those who entrusted me. Well, today I live a very different life. You could say half a world away. Instead of a small country town and a GP practice, I work with many to shape the science, political economy, and policy that influences lives across the planet. As was mentioned, I left medical school and completed my internship and then a little further, and strayed from the traditional health path to complete a Master's in Public Health, focused on chronic disease prevention in Cambodia. I worked in urban and rural areas of Cambodia with Buddhist monks through local Watts to explore, address and reduce heart disease and its risk factors. I saw firsthand the slow, insidious diseases that we're facing this community, and how it can act as a very real barrier to economic and social development. And then I did a PhD in public health, and I was lucky to work in Mongolia during the country's unprecedented transformation from poor to richer, from rural to more urban, and the transformation of its food systems to Western lifestyles. I watched as a country experience 20% GDP growth. It was the fastest in the world at the time, fueling a total change in the landscape of its capital, Ulaanbaatar. I actually saw the first KFC open and the 400-metre long line waiting to taste the West. I saw the ancient and rich culture of the Genghis Khan age, built around the family yurt, totally evolve and be replaced with high-rise living. I witnessed a nation that had 20 words to describe the colour of their horses leave the land and buy American four-wheel drives. And I studied and witnessed a complete shift in disease patterns that accompanied this fundamental transformation. I then spent 2 years doing a postdoc that saw me move from my home in Copenhagen to Harvard Medical School in the USA. I launched a social startup on connecting health issues to millennials and became passionate about driving a movement for global health change. Together with my team, we crowdsourced the funding and reached more than 2.5 million young people in our first 18 months with an organisation called NCD Free. We ran leadership boot camps on 4 continents and hosted more than 500 dinners throughout the world in a campaign we called Feast of Ideas, where we tabled big global health challenges in the living rooms of colleagues, peers and friends across the country and around the world, leading to important conversations for change. We crowdsourced the stories of more than 1,000 people living with chronic disease and created a film that we showed to 27 ministers of health at a gathering of the World Health Organization. One of more than 10 short films we created around the world over the last 5 years to give a name and a face to people living with chronic disease. I then worked with a team of 30 volunteers in 2015 to launch a free public festival in Melbourne to bring the most important collective discussions to light. We had 5,000 Victorians come to our first Festival 21, where we explored as one community how we address the biggest but ignored social and global health threats. The festival, I'm happy to say, returned just weeks ago to Melbourne, bigger and better, led by a new team and supported by my own Australian-based foundation. And last week I landed from Oslo, where I'm now leading a global NGO integrating some of the greatest challenges of our modern life: climate change, food security, global health, and malnutrition, having recently ended 3 years with the United Nations Agency for Health, the World Health Organization, in Geneva, where I was fortunate to provide technical support to governments and with a focus on vulnerable populations. Today, though, I'm honoured to focus my talk on your role as rural health leaders across our great nation. And it struck me coming into the convention centre before, into the hotel before, the incredible buzz and excitement after 4 full days that there still is in this community. And it's a reflection, I think, of the leadership that you have, but also, obviously, the great program that you've shared over the last short period. Because you are a diverse, inspired, and empowered group that has the tools, the knowledge, and the access to make enormous change. And while I'm passionate about the health of populations and influencing our global food systems, the health of this country and all Australians rests very much not in the hands of those in Melbourne or Sydney or even Canberra, but in your hands, in your leadership, and in your actions. So as you leave this inspiring week in Hobart and return to your roles as health leaders in your communities, what will each of you do differently and together to shift the dial on our greatest health challenges? Well, first, what are some of those threats? Today, the 4 greatest global challenges are problems we as humans have created. The very success we associate with the technological, social, and economic progress we've made over the past few centuries now threatens our health and the health of the planet we inhabit. The first, of course, is climate change. As the world passes the critical 410 parts per million concentration of atmospheric carbon, this year is once again on track to be the hottest on record. We are already approaching 1 degree of warming with an agreed global, safe and shared maximum limit of 2 degrees. We are halfway on this Titanic-style journey with no sign of emissions slowing, and with millions in poverty around the world yet to experience the opportunities that electricity and connectivity bring to the lives of us here in Australia every day. And don't be fooled, climate change is not just about rising sea levels and starving polar bears. It's about biodiversity, plant and animal extinction, ocean stewardship, respect for land, soil and water resources, and of course, centrally, fundamentally, human health. It's about the livelihoods of the 500 million smallholder farmers on this planet today, who continue to feed 1/3 of the global population. It's about the fishing communities that rely on ocean currents and stable ecosystems to provide food not only for their tables, but also for the tables of millions of people around the world. For the first time in decades, hunger is once again on the rise worldwide, due primarily to climate change in a world that has never been richer nor instantaneously interconnected. More people are being left outside of our global food system than there were last year. That is a confronting concept. More people are hungry across the planet today than last year after decades of declines. Climate change is now spurring armed conflicts, major waves of migration, threatening the food and economic sovereignty and the safety of communities across our planet. Serious threats which overwhelmingly and disproportionately affect the poorest, even here in Australia, and the communities least able or prepared to cope. In fact, we must not forget that rich or poor, rural or urban, we are all on one planet. We only have one planet. And our role as health leaders must be at a planetary scale, or at least a planetary scale of thinking. We must not forget that while 2.1 billion people now wake up overweight or obese across our planet due to a lack of access to good quality foods or over-access to the wrong types of foods, 830 million wake up hungry. That millions of people die needlessly early from preventable disease, and that 1 in 5 children across this world still have so little food for so long in their early years of life that they are permanently stunted for their entire life course. 1 in 5. They will never achieve their full social, intellectual, physical, and economic potential. As health professionals, we can and must be aware of the way we live in Australia and the local decisions we all make each day and the enormous toll it has on our planet's ecosystems drives climate change, which contributes to conflict and to hunger in the poorest communities half a world away. We are one planet. We have one planet. Climate change is a health problem, and you are the frontline health leaders. The second great challenge is non-communicable diseases. It's a mouthful, but it's heart disease, cancer, diabetes, mental illness, and chronic respiratory diseases, and the intermediate risk factors or disease, obesity. The fact is that we have allowed a slow-burning epidemic to creep up on our societies, such that today 2 in 3 Australian adults and 1 in 4 to 1 in 3 of our children are living with overweight and obesity. And 7 in 10 Australian deaths are now due to delayable causes, often associated with immense and needless suffering for even decades prior. These non-communicable diseases share common drivers, and despite therefore being collectively preventable, they together constitute 68% or roughly 7 in 10 global deaths. Now, these are not diseases of rich, old, white, lazy men. These are diseases that cause, deepen, and entrench poverty in our poorest populations, with our poorest populations and communities bearing the largest brunt of morbidity, suffering, and mortality or death. And don't be fooled, we have solutions. And yet, as a community and a government, we continue to do far too little, even as other nations step up and take meaningful action. England last month banned all junk food advertising on the London transport system and is implementing strict rules on children's TV. Chile, the country, has banned the use of cartoon characters on junk foods, including sugary cereals. Products known to contain multiple times the recommended amount of sugar for young children in a single serve, and cartoons that are known to attract young minds and incentivise nagging for already busy parents. Meanwhile, here in Australia, our politicians continue to allow some of the highest levels of junk food advertising during children's TV programming in the world. 1 in 3 ads are for food, and between half and 80% of these are for unhealthy foods. And despite whatever the industry will tell you, between 2011 and 2015, there was no reduction in the rate of unhealthy food advertising here in Australia. Advertising that is proven to increase the consumption of junk foods and junk drinks, even in children as young as 2 years old. Chile is implementing mandatory and clear front-of-pack labelling that make it easy for young consumers and their families to understand what is and what is not healthy. A system that has cut the likelihood of people choosing sugary breakfast cereals by 11% and sugary juices by almost a quarter. Peru and Uruguay are doing similar. Ecuador has clear traffic warning labels for products high in sugar, salt and fat. While here in Australia, we continue to argue about a voluntary system that experts agree is a good start but too weak, and we attack the public health sector for their efforts. We continue to insult every parent and affected young people by projecting what is an untruthful dogma that is contrary to clear evidence and sees child obesity somehow blamed on poor choices or poor parenting, ignoring somehow the fact that junk food outlets disproportionately saturate poorer neighbourhoods and rural and remote communities, and that one of the strongest predictors of developing and dying from a weight-related chronic disease is your postcode. False facts and conflicts of interest drive futile discussions that result in continued inaction. Our health minister makes proud announcements hand in hand with industry, while those very same industry players are shown to be funding fake research and manipulating foreign national governments and even United Nations agencies, including the department while I was working there at the World Health Organization. All while junk food fuels 2 in 3 Australians now being overweight, while 2 in 3 of those are malnourished of key nutrients. Australia's government currently spends little less than $89 per person on prevention, far less than Canada, the United Kingdom or New Zealand. And all while the economic burden of treating obesity-related disease is estimated to rise from $12 billion to $21 billion by 2025. So in other words, for every dollar we are spending on prevention, we'll soon be losing $10 from our economy because of a lack of action on obesity. The third main challenge, and this has already been mentioned as well, is growing inequality. We cannot be health leaders without having inequality in the front of our minds and the top of our agendas. Today, 50% of global wealth is held by just 26 people across the planet. By 2016, here in Australia, the poorest 20%, comprising 1.73 million households, had less wealth than the 10 wealthiest families. And over the past decades, there has been a quiet concentration of wealth and an insidious rise of social, economic and health inequality around us. The gap between rich and poor is now massive. Few seem too concerned, and our government is still doing too little to intervene. And when relative poverty is closely associated with almost every health outcome, diseases like diabetes, heart disease, mental illness, and various cancers all track closely with socioeconomics, that results directly in major economic costs to the individual, but also poses serious further barriers to work, education, and just generally getting ahead in life. One can see that poor health is a driver and a litmus test for this growing inequality. The final challenge is a result of all others, and particularly the growing divide between have and have not. It's the breakdown in trust and social contract within and across our societies. The glue that binds us as one, and the empathy that sees us leaning into challenges as a collective rather than turning our backs on one another while we close our doors, our minds, and our borders. It is a fear-fueled anger that divides and destroys communities, a community that fundamentally will need to work together if we're ever going to address the very same major challenges facing our imminent collective future. The good news is, and this is the last session of the conference, so I don't want to leave you totally depressed. The good news is, just as we as humans have created these challenges, we too can fix them. And the best news is that as healthcare leaders, we are an empowered group to catalyse this movement for change. First of all, as you return to your communities in the coming days and weeks, I humbly call on you to recognise and remember the incredible power that you possess as doctors, nurses, occupational therapists, physiotherapists, dietitians, healthcare leaders, and those that keep our hospitals and our healthcare system running, to be spokespeople in your towns and communities. When we speak, people listen. When we question, politicians respond. And when we demand, businesses act. As some of the most trusted and respected members of our society, there are few people better positioned or more able to shape and reshape societal and political rhetoric than us. And this is particularly so when we're talking about health or its social and commercial determinants. As a single leader, we must champion and shape the health of our patients. As a small group, we can work with local organisations and governments to influence the well-being of our own communities. But as a group of more than 1,000 powerful, respected professionals this week, with fundamentally our patients' best interests at heart, we are a formidable political voice for change. And as a federal election looms, we need that change. This is not about party politics. It is about responsible policy from any side that will act. We can and should have a voice as a community that stands for government action to protect and promote health in our communities, whatever political viewpoint. Because Virchow famously said, the physician, and I interpret that as the healthcare leader, is the natural attorney for the poor, the vulnerable, the voiceless, and the marginalised. The second thing to do or to think about is to be champions of rethinking our health system. Today, approximately 1 million Australians suffer from type 2 diabetes, and a further 500,000 are likely to be affected but unaware. As we mentioned, 2 in 3 Australians are living with an unhealthy weight, and millions more struggle to access, afford, or consume nutritious foods. We are spending unprecedented sums on preventable disease, yet less than 2% of recurrent health expenditure on prevention. That's 2% of 8% of GDP in a country where the annual costs of treating obesity will be $21 billion by 2025. Understanding the importance of prevention in all its forms and the impact of the social determinants of health on well-being of patients and populations cannot be underestimated. We must urge governments to increase investments in avoiding disease and keeping our communities healthy to begin with. Further integrate this into our own practice and see its advocacy as a core responsibility within our mandate. Prevention-focused healthcare must be the future of any sustainable healthcare system. Primary care must be one of the key platforms, and rural health leaders can lead this transformation. But it is also crucial to remember that prevention starts at home. Taking care of ourselves is not just good business, it's good sense. We cannot be credible advocates for our patients if we do not understand firsthand how difficult it is to live in a healthy way in 2019 Australia. Taking care of ourselves not only builds empathy for the challenges our patients face, but it grows resilience in our healthcare community in the face of what is often a tough, lonely, and difficult job. Take care of yourself and those around you so you can take care of others. Next is to connect the dots. Looking back on the week, this is a key message of the program here in Hobart. The days of one pathogen causing the majority of community disease are long gone. And as my former WHO Director General Margaret Chan said, our major health enemies these days are stronger, more powerful and more complex than ever before. As a coalition, we must look beyond health outcomes and see our roles and our voice to question the true determinants of health in our current system, the determinants behind the determinants. I invite you all to think about your role in calling on inaction which leads to profits for companies at the expense of populations. We need to be asking questions like, why do we allow McDonald's or other fast food restaurants to saturate rural communities and poorer neighbourhoods, but not demand that the same neighbourhoods are equipped with adequate, affordable access to fresh and healthy alternatives? Challenge how in a nation that is wealthier than ever before, we still have a 10 to 20 year life expectancy gap between the richest and the most marginalised. Ask why we allow purposeful, pernicious and predatory marketing of children by soft drink companies and others in TV times when we know that they're likely watching alone and for products we know are associated with disease. Demand answers on how it could be possible in 2019 for nutritious foods to cost 3, 4 or even 5 times the cost for citizens in remote postcodes as their urban counterparts, in a nation whose farming and rural communities have and always will power our economy. Challenge governments that equate obesity to poor decision-making, or when they put childhood obesity simply down to poor parenting. Understanding and challenging these deeper factors that drive ill health in our patients, we cannot underestimate our ability to shape and reshape health, healthcare, and policy outcomes. These are the issues that our profession must see, confront, and challenge, because health leaders must be that voice of reason, of equity, and of a healthier global and local future. Finally, and before I close, I want to take a moment and reflect on what being a leader actually means. And these are just my reflections. I'm still fairly young. I understand many of you have many decades more experience as leaders than I do. So I humbly offer these as a few ideas of what I feel I've learnt over my time in public health. Because we are leaders in our communities. People look to us for guidance and advice, but this does come with enormous responsibility. And particularly at the moment when we see what's going on around the world. false facts, ignorance-fueled blame, fear-driven anger. What does it mean to be a leader? What are our North Star principles to guide us in guiding others? The first, one must have clarity and understand what drives us as an individual. Understanding why we do what we do and putting this front and centre in our minds, particularly in times of criticism or setback, for me, I've been driven by an indelible memory of poverty and suffering that I saw working in communities across Australia as a clinician, but also around the world. And the knowledge that this suffering is in fact preventable if we choose as a population to take our governments to task and to work with them to address these deep and often hidden determinants of ill health. I'm also driven by this person, the one on the far right, May. She's my 3-year-old niece. And in 2050, she will live in a world of almost 10 billion people on this earth. 10 billion, a 50% increase on today. And she will be my age. And at that moment, she will either live in a world that is on the brink of total catastrophe from health and climate threats unmanaged and ignored for decades, or she will live on a planet that is safe, sustainable, and where no one is left behind. And I want the latter for May. But this requires action today, and this is what drives me as a leader. Second thing is leadership takes commitment. The road ahead and translating everything that we've taken from this week and making it a reality will not be easy. We have some big challenges to overcome. But day by day, we can move mountains. And meanwhile, others will be inspired to begin to help. Starting in our families, in our practices, next in our communities, confronting those who simply blame ill health on laziness and fail to see those underlying drivers, or those that cannot and will not acknowledge the dangers a changing climate pose to us, or even that the climate is changing. Commitment to our cause for the long term will be key. But this also requires for us to take moments of respite. Promoting and protecting the health of our patients and our nation will be a marathon effort, not a sprint. To persevere, we're going to need to take moments where we rest, reflect and restore, and even better, this is done with our peers. The third is courage. Nobody likes change. The irony is, though, that change has slowly crept up on us. And today we find ourselves in a situation where tough and substantive decisions are required to correct the course of our collective health. It hasn't always been easy to voice my concerns. I've had challenges, and at times I've even had threats. And in fact, this has usually been an indicator that I'm barking up the right tree. As health leaders, we must have the courage to speak out, to stand up, to rethink, and to act. But courage is also about thinking beyond the square. The way we practice medicine today, with clinicians all too often at the centre and treating disease outcomes as our focus, cannot really continue. A healthcare system that ignores the digital revolution, that simply protects its own turf, instead of evolving to deliver better quality healthcare for more people and with better outcomes, will soon become unaffordable, inequitable and unethical. As leaders in the rural health field, you can be leaders in also rethinking creatively how medicine can and should evolve. And you're already doing that. Fourth is that a leader must also care. The fundamental attribute that makes a clinician a great clinician and a great clinician leader, I believe, is caring. Embodied through its dual attributes of outward-facing empathy and inward-facing integrity, showing time and time again that patients can trust us and our actions, but also our decisions. Virchow called us to protect the vulnerable, the voiceless and the marginalised, and the basis of leadership and action is caring. And finally, as is reflected in the very ethos of this conference, a hallmark of any great leader is collaboration. The greatest health threats in the 20th century were not solved by health leaders. They were solved by engineers providing safe drinking water to billions. They were solved by farmers improving the efficiency of our food system, and microbiologists making Nobel-worthy breakthroughs to prevent infection. And each were powered by economic growth that pulled billions out of poverty. This century, it is very likely that the greatest threats, like climate change and even obesity, will be solved by lawyers, economists, and if we're lucky, brave politicians. Having the humility as health leaders to see our important role in forging partnerships with those that have the relationships, the knowledge, and the influence to create change at scale, to improve the health of populations, is a mark of true leadership. The city of Philadelphia didn't get a tax on sugary drinks for health reasons. It was possible because it was an economic tool to fund early child education. Collaborating with other sectors and learning from them will be critical in solving what are health-related outcomes driven largely by economic and political drivers. In other words, we really are better together. So as you leave this conference and return as leaders in communities across our nation, take a moment to reflect on the week, on the challenges we collectively face, on what drives us all deep inside, but also the enormous power we have to create change. In the face of large and often overwhelming collective challenges, it's easy to lose sight of the influence of your position as health leaders. Let's choose to be a great generation of health leaders that continue to deeply care and therefore change our patients' lives for the better. But let's also be that generation that challenge and affect upstream determinants that lead to disease on a wider scale in the first place. Let's not see that the workplace ends at the wall of our clinics, but let's see that that's only just where it begins. Let's connect the dots on health and not just tackle the outcomes of disease, but also the structural, economic, cultural drivers that cause it to begin with. Because being a health leader and the responsibility that comes with it is truly immense. The trust it grants us, the voice it lends us, and the opportunities for making truly profound impact in the lives of others cannot be underestimated. We often don't know where life will take us or the opportunities it will afford. And who knows, maybe I'll live my dream of being a country doctor still someday. But one thing we do know, and we very too often forget, is that as the 1% of the 1%, and as some of the most educated, empowered professionals in society on a journey of profound responsibility, and as one of more than 1,000 in probably the most powerful coalition for political change in this country, never lose sight of your role and its responsibility. Never forget the words of Virchow. Never underestimate your voice, and never lose sight of your impact as rural health leaders. Thank you.
All right, wise words indeed. I'd like to invite Tanya Lehman, the chair of the National Rural Health Alliance, up to make a few comments in closing. This will be the last time you hear from me, so I'd just like to acknowledge it's been a pleasure hosting you in Hobart, in Tasmania, my home state, with Janine Mohammed for the first part of this conference. I could be the first pharmacist that's been asked to MC the National Rural Health Conference, but I haven't fact-checked that, so please don't do that either. I'd like to thank the Alliance for giving me the opportunity and also managing this biennial event and giving the rural health sector a voice. It's a worthy voice and it should be a louder voice, and we've had politicians here over the last 3 or 4 days, so hopefully they listen to us. I appreciate it's a really big effort to get here. It's not easy to get to Tasmania from most parts of the country unless you're in Melbourne or Sydney. So thank you for coming. We realise that you're away from your families, your work, your communities, but it is worth it. We are better together. I'd also like to thank personally Leanne, who's managed and coached me through most of this and provided the run sheets that I've been reading off for the last 3 or 4 days. So big hand to Leanne and the staff. And also the staff of the venue and the light and sound people, particularly Sam and Dave. These sort of things are really tough when videos don't run for presenters and mics don't work, so we haven't had any of that. It's the first flawless conference that I've been chairing at, so thank you very much. I'll leave you with Tanya. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Well, good afternoon. You're the intrepid ones that have stayed to the very end, so congratulations on making it this far. So as we near the end of the 15th National Rural Health Conference, it's my pleasure to thank all of the amazing people who have been responsible for putting this event together. As you can imagine, an event like this doesn't just happen without a lot of people working together. I'm sure you will all agree that this event has been an inspiring example of how we really are better together. Firstly, thank you to beautiful Nipaluna or Hobart and Tasmania. If anyone thought you couldn't bring 1,100 delegates, conference delegates to Hobart with 10 concurrent sessions, 75 exhibitors, over 230 speakers and a sit-down dinner for 90, then we've just proven them wrong. A big thank you to the Hotel Grand Chancellor, General Manager Ralph Freckleton, Renee Casey from Sales and Marketing, and Mark Lomansey and their team of wonderful staff for looking after us so well over the last 4 days. And special thanks to Chef Pierre and his team for feeding us such delicious and healthy food. Big shout out to the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre for all their advice and support over the last year, and for our amazing people who so warmly welcomed us to country, both here and at the dinner. It's been a real privilege to understand and to have some appreciation of your custodianship of this land. I do want to add my thanks to Joe and Janine, who did a fab job as amateur MCs. It's always great to have people who are from council to step into roles like this, and you know, they were cheaper than professional ones, but I reckon they did a good job. So thanks, Joe. Also, I want to thank the local conference advisory committee, people who are from this area who provided us with local knowledge and support over the last year, and particularly to Joe Walker and the program committee for putting together such a diverse and interesting program. Thanks, Joe. I don't know if she's in the room, but I do want to acknowledge and thank the wonderful dancing queen, Kelly Drummond-Cawthorne, for curating the amazing, inspirational, heartwarming Arts in Health program that's run throughout the conference. You know, sometimes they say build it and they will come, and when you're hosting a conference and you've got your idea about how many people you want to turn up, it's always such a great relief when they do indeed come. So thank you, all of you, for coming, for taking time out from your busy lives and your families and your work back home, and for taking the time to sit with us, reflect with us, and to share your wisdom. I also want to pay particular homage to the intrepid and fabulous interpretive and daggy dancers at the night of the dinner. You know who you are. You lit up the dance floor, so thank you for joining me in that. The AV team, Joe's already acknowledged, but Joe Meany and his dynamic team of techie nerds and Damien Free from the local AV company, Scene Change, have been fantastic. To all our member bodies of the Alliance and all the members of the National Rural Health Alliance Council who are here, who wore the shirts and helped you out throughout the week, thank you. I do want to acknowledge Mark Diamond, our CEO, who many of you may know has advised us he's returning to the land of consultants at the end of this financial year. He has done such a great job as as a CEO over the last 18 months, moved us forward as an organisation, and he's still got quite a bit of work to go, so he's not allowed to leave just yet. But we are recruiting a new CEO who Mark will hopefully be around to help with the transition of. So if anyone you know is interested in leading one of the most awesome organisations, amazing people that believe wholeheartedly in working collaboratively to address the health of rural and remote Australians, then come and see me and we'll hook you up with the details. And last but certainly not by any means least, I do want to pay particular homage to our Alliance staff and the conference team and the intrepid, unbelievable, unstoppable, amazing Leanne Coleman, without whom this conference wouldn't have happened. So at the start of the conference, I shared with you the details of the agenda of a rural health meeting of state and territory federal ministers in 1990. And that agenda was eerily familiar. I challenge you to consider what it will take to move the agenda forward for us to ensure that as a rural health sector, we can move beyond admiring the problem and yes, describing it better and in more fulsome ways, but move beyond admiring our problems and the challenges we face to bringing about the real transformative change that our sector needs and that our communities deserve. What will it take, I guess, to realise a future free from the unacceptable inequities? So we all crave simple solutions to our very complex and intractable problems, but each of us knows that the silver bullets don't work for us. And like a child going on a bear hunt, there is no way under it, no way over it, and no way around these problems. We must work through them. And we must face them straight in the eye, muster up all our courage, creativity, resourcefulness, tenacity and perseverance, all those things that country folk are famous for, and tackle them head on. We know we can do it because we stand on the shoulders of the giants who've come before us. We carry with us all the wisdom of our elders, the trailblazers, the innovators, the collaborators, the disruptors. People who have shown us that real change is possible and that we are indeed better together. So if I were to identify one thing, one powerful message that has woven its way through this conference and stood out to me as the secret sauce, the big clue on how we're going to get there, it has been storytelling. Time and time again over the last 4 days, I have been inspired by the power of storytelling, of raw, authentic, passionate, vulnerable truth-telling. The skill of yarning, of sharing parts of ourselves and to engage with the hearts, shift the mindsets and bring about the transformation that we're all seeking. So Harry Burns showed us the profound impact of increasing the percentage of children who consistently experience just a few minutes a day connecting deeply with an adult by sharing a story at bedtime. He challenged us to not focus on the problems, but on the goal of attaining a complete state of physical, social and psychological well-being. He advised us the way to get there is through through flipping traditional public policy thinking on its head. We need to empower our frontline workers, genuinely share power with our communities to co-design, trial and adjust bottom-up solutions in our context. No one-size-fits-all, no silver bullet, simply working better together. We also heard many powerful stories from speakers over the past 4 days, and I won't mention them, there are way too many to mention, but I'm sure each of you has some that you'll be taking as particularly impactful going home. These stories serve to remind us that the current inequities aren't good enough, but we actually know what we need to do, and we know how to tackle them. And we know that focusing just on the health system isn't enough. It needs to be about the social and cultural determinants of health. So as the wealthiest country in the world, we do have the resources to work our way through our complex challenges. We just need to make better choices on how we distribute our wealth and what we invest in. So on the cusp of the release of the federal budget and a federal election, now is the time to demand that governments invest in the future health and well-being of rural and remote Australians. As you head home back to your families, your communities and your busy lives, I encourage you to stay connected with each other. Keep sharing stories with each other, with governments, with policymakers and decision makers, because we can improve the health and well-being of rural and remote Australians if we remember that we are better together. Thank you.
Warrena Balawa, Warrena Balawa, Warrena Balawa, me a lady, me a lady, me a lady, me a lady.
Just gonna urge everyone to clap and sing with me.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Off we go. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, yo, 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 yo. Yo, 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 yo. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yo, 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 yo. Yo, 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 yo. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yo, 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 yo. Yeah, 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 yo, yo. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, 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 yeah. Few more. They've got to get up. Come on. Yeah, 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 yeah. 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 Chuba, 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 yeah. Chuba, 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 yeah. Nagare come sango, nagare come sango, 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 yeah. Chuba, chuba. Nagare come sango, nagare come sango, 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 yeah.
Nagaru kan sango, nagaru kan sango, nagaru kan sango, 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 chuma nagara ya kan sango, 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 sango. Nagaru kan sango, nagaru kan sango, nagaru kan sango. Chuba, 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 chuba. Chuba, 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 chuba. Chuba, 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 chuba. Chuba, 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 chuba. Nagaru kan sango, nagaru kan sango.
Milay di na